Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
I am here with Doug Conant, who is the only former Fortune 500 CEO who is a New York Times bestselling author, a top 50 leadership innovator, a top 100 leadership speaker, and a top 100 most influential author in the world. Doug began his career as an entry-level marketing assistant at General Mills and held leadership positions in marketing and strategy at Kraft before becoming CEO and president of Campbells Soup Company. During his career, he also served as president of Nabisco Foods and chairman of Avon Products. And over 10 years as CEO at Campbell's, his employee engagement skyrocketed from being among the worst Fortune 500 to being world-class as measured by Gallup. So as a result of this and other key transformational improvements, Doug led Campbell's to from a beleaguering 2001 to delivering competitive performance in their top tier of the global food industry by the time he retired in 2011. And now he is the author of The Blueprint, 6 Practical Steps to Lift Your Leadership to New Heights. I've been fortunate to interview Doug in the past, and I'm so excited to have him talk to me today about his new book. So welcome, Doug.
Well, thank you, Diane. I didn't realize I had so many wonderful credentials until you read them all. That was a wonderful long bio. I was basking in the glow. Thank you.
That's the shortened version, too. You know, I think I told you when we talked last time, I've taught thousands of online business courses. And I think your case study is mentioned in just about every course I've ever taught, because nobody has done what you did with Campbell's. I mean, you're a hero in the business world, as you should be. And I think it's just such an interesting look. Before we get into your book, I want to just bring up the Campbell's Soup thing, because you're known for writing so many handwritten notes and getting people to feel like you really cared about them, because you did. And I asked you, and I want you to think again on this one, how many notes did you write in the time that you were at Campbell's Soup, and who did you write them to?
Well, I'll answer that straight away, but just to preface the comment, you know, I spent 10 years before I was at Campbell working in the world's largest LBO at the time, owned by KKR, Nabisco, and we were going from a beleaguered situation there to top tier food industry performance over that decade. And I had a chance to develop an approach over that decade where I learned from some amazing people in that company that I could then apply to my next 10 years when I went to Campbell. So it wasn't, I had been in the trenches for a long time before I got to Campbell. At Campbell, we were a beleaguered company. I started writing notes to people because I found that for the most part, our company, like all companies, was incredibly good at what was finding what was wrong, but was never very good at celebrating what was right. And even in the most troubled companies, 8 out of 10 things being done are being done properly. And so what I try to do wherever I work is bring balance to the conversation. So we celebrate what's working while we deal with what's not working. So at Campbell, I found we were really good at figuring out what wasn't working. So I said, I've got to move the scales in a new direction. I wrote 10 to 20 notes a day, 6 days a week, handwritten, sent them to people the very next day, if not the same day. And I'm talking snail mail now all around the world. And we were FedExing these letters to people all around the world every day. And in the course of the 10 years I was there, I wrote over 30,000 notes to Campbell employees, and we only had 20,000 employees. So wherever you went in the world, you saw one of my handwritten notes stuck up in a cubicle somewhere, thanking someone for doing something that mattered. The only other thing on the note piece is, I believe these notes shouldn't necessarily feel as if they're gratuitous.
Right.
I always try and celebrate things of merit where someone has added value to what we're trying to do, so that they know I'm paying attention to performance while I'm celebrating their contribution.
Yeah, you know, what you put in a note really matters. I've known people who write the same note and give it to 20 people and it's 4 pages long and it just, you know, copied and pasted.
Yeah.
And it has no meaning. And if anything, it does the opposite of what you're trying to do. And what you did was just so impressive. And I have to bring that up since you're so known for that. And I think anybody who hasn't listened to the radio show that you were on of mine, I want to make sure they listen to that as well. But that they realize that you're known for so many things, and that's just one of them. But I want to talk about your new book, because this is very exciting. I mean, you've written other things in the past, but this is your latest for 2020. And as I said, it's called The Blueprint, 6 Practical Steps to Lift Your Leadership to New Heights. What made you want to write another book?
Well, I think we need to champion the notion of enlightened leadership in the 21st century. The old hierarchies and structures that I started with are breaking down, and the leadership models of the past aren't holding up to scrutiny in the present. At the same time, the leadership models that are evolving in the present haven't been very well developed or thought through and are being led by some somewhat immature leaders who haven't got the experience necessary to lead them with the kind of finesse and touch and insight that needs to come with that leadership challenge. So I felt that I could bridge that gap and provide what I think is an enlightened approach to leadership that deals with all the idealism that we want to bring to this work, but does it in a realistic way where, as a leader, you can actually act on it and do something. I have a lot of friends in the leadership industry, and I admire them. But you know what? Virtually all the people that write about this have never done it.
Yeah.
And they're good. They're students of it. They add a lot of value. They're not kept awake at night at 1 o'clock in the morning thinking about how am I going to get through this board meeting or this meeting tomorrow, and then do the same thing every day, 365 days a year, while they're trying to raise families and do other things too. So the change process that we created with this book was one that sort of, I believe, meets the leadership challenge of the day and does it in a way that's approachable for somebody who's swamped and feeling like they're trying to get a sip of water from the fire hydrant of life every day. They barely have time to say hello and goodbye to their kids. And we're writing books about here's how you got to change your leadership life. And they don't have time to read them. They don't have time to work with them. So we've got to create a process that's a bite-sized process that acknowledges the reality of what these leaders are facing every day. And we've done that with this book.
You know, you bring up so many good points with that as far as, you know, inexperience and different things and who has time for all this. I had a boss who would read 2 books a week and he wanted everybody to read 2 books a week. I'm like, how do you have time to, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, to read so much? And I think a lot of people don't. And so I like the bite-size aspect of that. But when you're talking about the reality of being in leadership, what you were saying brought to mind, I had interviewed Keith Kroc, who was the CEO and chairman of DocuSign. And he said when he decided to take that position, he warned his wife that he's going to be in the fetal position every once in a while on the floor under his desk. It's just what happens because it's so challenging, the reality of, you know, researching this as a researcher versus actually living it. And so you've lived it, and not everything was always wonderful for you. You had really setbacks in your career. You talked about it the last time we spoke about being abruptly unemployed, shall we put it, which I can't imagine anybody ever letting you go. And whoever did that's probably just had to really kick themselves later. But can you tell a little bit about that story and how that you used what you learned in this book?
Yeah, first of all, this book is really the culmination of 45 years of leadership experience, 45 years in the trenches. We're about to release a video in social media next week. you know, I've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of people write about it, but nobody has walked 40 years in the leader's shoes as I have, starting at the very entry level and working their way up to the C-suite, to the chairman role. So I try and bring that to this work. I've made mistakes all along the way. I was let go 10 years into my career in a very challenging way, but I hadn't really done enough to warrant them keeping me. You know, I don't think I'd made any serious mistakes, but I hadn't really grown into the leader that I'm trying to become today. And along the way, I've made tons of mistakes. I was one of those leaders that gave those books out 2 a week and said, you ought to read them. You know, and I would say, well, this, you know, leading people, and I believe this, you're on sacred ground. You're affecting people's lives. And you need to take that seriously, and you need to work at it. It's like anything else. If you want to be good at it, you need to work at it. So I was using that as an excuse to challenge people to do unrealistic things. And so that's the piece that I'm trying to address with this piece of work. In terms of when I lost my job, I went into work one day and the senior vice president called me up to his office and said, Doug, we appreciate your service here, but it's no longer required. Your job has been eliminated. You need to be out of here by noon. And I'd been working for the company for almost 10 years.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, my life felt like it was over in a snap. And I had to go home and tell my wife, with my newborn baby, our second child, and a big mortgage, I'm out of work. And it was incredibly difficult. And I went through several setbacks along the way, like everybody does. And I found that you really need to develop a solid leadership foundation to weather the storms that are going to come your way. And the time to work on that is before you need it. And that's what this book is about. It's helping people fortify their leadership foundation. So when they encounter these difficult things, which they will, you have, I have, they'll be prepared for them. And they can lead in an enlightened way when it gets tough, and it will get tough. And it only gets tougher the higher you go. So this is all about proactively strengthening your leadership foundation so that you can show up and be your best version of yourself when you need to, when you face all of the adversity that you will inevitably face.
Well, you know, you bring up really important things that I've taught in a lot of courses based. Stephen Covey, first thing he wrote, be proactive to change, right? And if you're not proactive to it, it's very difficult once it happens to you. And you talk about dealing with change in more of an incremental way, as I recall, because I think a lot of people, I remember, you know, being a doctoral chair, I'd have all my students, you know, look at this 200-page thing they'd have to write and freak out, right? But if you look at it as little bits and pieces, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time kind of approach, it's a lot easier. Is it the same thing with change? Do we need to think of it in smaller bites?
There's a lot of good work done on this. James Clear just, you know, his new book, fairly new, last year or two, Atomic Habits, talks about the power of incremental change. There's another wonderful book called Tiny Habits, which is written by B.F. Flog, and that is all about making incremental change. There's another professor from UCLA, I believe, Dr. Maurer, who has written extensively on this subject, and he talks about basically, if you want to get in shape, you think about, we all, after the holidays, we all have these goals for diets, right? And I'm going to lose 15 pounds, and here's how I'm going to do it. And we lose momentum by what, week 3 maybe, or week 4. It's hard to sustain because why? Because it hasn't nested perfectly in the middle of my cockamamie life. If it fits in my life,
Right.
As crazy as it is, I can see my way through to doing it. Big things do not nest, big changes do not nest perfectly in the middle of your cockamamie life.
Right.
And so what my observation is from experience and from study is if we really want change to happen, it has to nest perfectly in your cockamamie life, and then you can gently move it somewhere in a positive direction. And by the way, as you move in that positive direction, you begin to feel better about yourself, and you begin to have more confidence in your ability to change. Dr. Maurer, in his book about small changes having big impact, he talks about a woman. He was sitting in on a consultation with a general practitioner while he was doing his studies, and he talks about a divorced woman with 2 kids, working, and didn't feel good about herself, gaining weight. And so she goes into the doctor. He's sitting in on the consultation, and the doctor, of course, is going to say, well, you've got to carve out an hour a day for yourself to get in shape.
Uh-huh.
And Dr. Mauer's sitting there thinking, I'm asserting this. I'm quite sure I'm not misrepresenting the idea. But he's sitting there thinking, how is this woman going to carve out an hour of her day with her 2 kids and her job to go work out? Dr. Maurer said, could we try something different? You have, and it turned out she had a treadmill at home. Okay, for the next 2 weeks, can you just go stand on the treadmill for 2 minutes a day? Just stand on the treadmill. Get from wherever you are to the treadmill for 2 minutes a day. And then 2 weeks later, she comes into the office beaming. I did it. I was on the treadmill for 2 minutes a day. You know, I can begin to carve this into my cockamamie life. And in the fullness of time, in a thoughtful, manageable way, she was able to carve out time incrementally in order to make the changes that she knew she needed to make. And I have found if we make the changes too big and too unapproachable, we have a negative effect because we start to feel guilt about, well, I'm not doing it. I can't, you know, and it has the exact opposite effect of what you want to have. So with leadership change, we suggest you develop small practices that are anchored in the leader you want to be. And we have a whole process for that, which I can talk about in a minute. And then you start to act on those principles day one after you've been through the program. And these practices start immediately to change your leadership life.
Well, you know, what's interesting about that is when I've been researching perception is how we all look at what's reasonable and what isn't reasonable in different ways. You can have 2 people do the exact same job. You give them something, one person's head explodes because it's too much. The other person's like, yeah, nothing, you know? So how do we know how much is reasonable?
Hey, this is the beauty of what we do. And I've landed on this. I've been teaching elements of this now for since I was CEO of Campbell's for almost 20 years. And I think everyone has their own personal leadership model. I don't think any 2 leadership models are alike because I don't think any 2 people are alike.
Right.
And I think the only person that can intelligently and smartly create a leadership model is you for yourself. What works for you? Now, you need to bring some enlightened thinking to that, the creation of that model, which we try and facilitate in our book. But I believe everyone has a different leadership model. And the key is, can they start to show up being the best version of themselves, which I would call authenticity, be authentic,
right,
and be increasingly effective in their work in a way that is fulfilling for them in life. So I'm pushing for authenticity, effectiveness, and fulfillment. And the only way I believe you can do that is if you craft something that speaks uniquely to you. If you start, you know, I've got in this library here, I have hundreds of books on leadership. None of them speak perfectly to me. There are elements in a variety of places that have informed me and helped me shape my journey, but nothing speaks to me perfectly.
Right.
And if it doesn't, the odds of me derailing in my leadership development efforts they're high.
Yeah.
So we have a process where we have them go through 6 steps. The first step is just let's become clear about what our purpose is as a leader. And we have them go through some exercises to identify that. The next step is let's reflect on your life. Because I would contend that your life story is your leadership story. And if you talk to any leader, all the leaders you interview, if you say, tell me what's had the most influence on you, they all tell you a personal story.
Right.
They don't say, well, I talked to this researcher and they gave me a blinding glimpse of the obvious, or I read this book and it changed my life.
Right.
They all have a personal story. So I think you start there, you have a clearer sense of purpose, you reflect on your life story and how it's influenced your beliefs about leadership. The third step is to study beyond the four walls of your own experience and learn from these brilliant minds that are helping shape the leadership journey of the world. And you harvest some of those learnings as well. So you envision, you reflect, you study, and then you build your own personalized leadership plan, which is step 4. Step 5 is to develop practices that bring that personalized plan to life in a way that nests perfectly in your cockamamie life. And the 6th step is to develop a continuous improvement process that allows you to kind of go back through those same 6 steps easily and say, okay, how am I doing? Is my purpose quite right? Have I adequately reflected? Is there more to learn? Who should I be studying today? Okay, how does that affect my plan? Okay, what are some new practices I could employ that might even help me become more effective? And then how can I improve on that? So we have this continuous improvement loop that's built around envision, reflect, study, plan, practice. Small bites that are anchored in who you are and who you want to become as a leader.
You know, that's such great advice. And you talk about declaring yourself in your book. And I found that really interesting, all that you're talking about, because I studied emotional intelligence in my dissertation process. And to develop relationships, you not only have to understand other people's emotions, you have to understand your own emotions. You have to understand how all of this is for great interpersonal relationships. So can you just talk a little bit about what you mean by declaring yourself? Is that all that 6-step process, or is there something else?
Well, as part of declare yourself, that's a practice. Mm-hmm. So you develop your plan, and then a practice is telling people what your plan is. So, but let's step back for a minute. Okay. If you think about, I think I shared earlier that we are all trying to get a sip of water from the fire hydrant of life, and it's overwhelming. But what we tend to lose sight of is that our boss is dealing with the same issue. All of our peers are also trying to get a sip of water from the fire hydrant of life. All the people that work for us are in the same boat. None of them are really spending a lot of time trying to read our minds and know what we think.
Right.
They're overwhelmed too. So I contend that people are not mind readers. And if you want them to understand where you're coming from, you need to tell them.
Right.
This is, to me, emotional intelligence 101. Clarity is next to godliness here. If you tell them what's coming and where you're coming from, the odds of them engaging with you in a more meaningful way are infinitely higher. That's basically how we took employee engagement at Campbell from being the worst in the Fortune 500 to being the best in the Fortune 500 over the decade. We would thoughtfully create how we wanted to move forward. We'd tell everybody not just what we wanted to do, but how we wanted to do it and how we were going to show up every day. And then we held ourselves accountable to that standard. So we declared ourselves to the folks, and then we held ourselves accountable to it. This notion of declaring yourself is all about creating accountability. If I'm working on my diet again, and if it's just, that diet is just between me, myself, and I haven't told anybody, I haven't told my wife, I haven't told anybody else, the odds of me sticking with that diet go down.
Right.
As soon as I start to share it with my wife and my kids or the people I work with, the odds of me sticking with it go up. I feel more accountable.
Right.
And so And again, I come back to leading people. You're on sacred ground. You're affecting people's lives. You better show that you care about that and you're thinking about it seriously. You better create a platform for engaging with them that's meaningful to them. A line that I've used often is, you cannot expect people to value your agenda as a leader if you don't tangibly demonstrate to them that you value their agenda as a person. It just doesn't work any other way. So if you care about them, you need to tell them,
Right.
and you need to show them, and then you need to hold yourself accountable to showing up that way 24/7. And so this declaring yourself it's foundational to that notion of you need to go public with your commitment to being a better leader. It serves every leader well. And then you have to honor that declaration. I mean, you have to show up that way.
Yeah.
And many leaders are reluctant to declare themselves because they want the wiggle room. And that you can get away with that for a while, especially some of our political leaders. But ultimately, it comes back to roost. You need to stand up and be counted as a leader.
Well, as you're talking about this, it brings to mind some of my work with curiosity and culture, and some of the things I've talked to a lot of leadership, experts about, because we know culture comes from the top, and we know that, you have to walk the walk. And if you want to have, for example, if you want a curious culture, that you have to make people realize that their contributions matter, that no question is a dumb question kind of thing. But then a lot of leaders are afraid to ask things or to show that they maybe don't know all the answers as well. So they lack the ability to really walk the walk and show people that this is what I really want to see from you, because look at what I'm doing. I'm being vulnerable too. Do you think that that's a very hard thing for leaders to show, that vulnerability?
I couldn't agree with you more. And we're on Brene Brown territory here,
Right. Yeah.
with a touch of Maya Angelou as well. And look, courage is essential here. I love Maya Angelou. She has a quote about courage being the mother of all virtues, because you can't do anything else with consistency unless you have the courage of your convictions. And what our book is about, the blueprint, is about helping people develop a fortified leadership foundation where they can have the courage to show up with conviction when they're being tested. I think the reason people are reluctant is they haven't really thought it through. They're not really well grounded in who they are, how they want to walk in the world.
Right.
And if you're not well grounded, you're going to be incredibly vulnerable to the winds of change. And we know the winds of change are blowing faster from more directions than ever before. So I believe leaders need to be more fortified in their foundation. What's my purpose? How do I want to walk in the world? What are my core beliefs about leadership? What's my leadership model? What are the practices I'm going to use to show up that way every day? Thank you notes, that's a practice. At the core of my leadership model is honor people. It's at the center of everything I think about. And a practice I have is handwriting thank you notes to people, celebrating what they're doing right. And if it's not working, I also have a practice of talking to them about what's not working. So, but you have to bring it to life. And if they know that my commitment to them, it starts with honoring people, inspiring trust, and clarifying a higher purpose. Those are my first three elements of my Conant leadership model. They know how I'm going to show up. And then the challenge is to be so fortified in that foundation that when I'm challenged, I can show up that way with confidence. And a lot of leaders, when I lost my job, my outplacement counselor was ruthless. He was brilliant. He was a challenging fellow. And he said, Doug, you're going to be a terrible interview. He said, you don't have your act together. I'm asking you these hard questions and you're giving me all this mumbo jumbo meandering around. He said, you can't answer these questions well because you really haven't thought it through yet. You have some work to do about where do you stand on these things. And boy, what a life lesson and what a gift he was to me 10 years into my career, because I spent the next 35 years actually thinking about it and refining it. But I think leaders need to be a little more reflective, be a little more well anchored in what they stand for, and then have a plan with tangible behaviors that bring that to life and that nest perfectly in their cockamamie life.
As you say that, it's, you're known for bringing engagement up because of this. And I'm curious how you think curiosity plays into that. You mentioned asking them what's not working. How much do you think curiosity ties into engagement and improving it?
Well, I think it's huge. I think it's huge. And, I'm going to kind of bridge over into some of Jim Collins' work with his level 5 leadership model. He talked about what really he was surprised at some of the lessons he learned when he did Good to Great. And some of these leaders, he was expecting they were all going to be Jack Welch type, hard-charging guys. And he had never heard of any of these leaders. And he said, what's going on here? And as he did the work and he did his level 5 leadership model, he said there are two really distinguishing characteristics here. One is they have a fierce resolve to advance the enterprise. It's not about themselves, it's about advancing the enterprise. The second thing he said is they have great humility. They're always curious. They're always asking. They don't have all the answers, and they know it. And they share that with everybody. What do you think?
Yeah.
How could we do this better? And, when I heard Jim talking about it, it was like, and this goes back to, 2000. I was thinking, wow, that makes so much sense to me. Because in my heart of hearts, I had to act as if I had all the answers. But in my heart of hearts, I was a new CEO, and I didn't have all the answers. And I found there was more power, much more power, in bringing more humility to the conversation and asking more questions and showing that we placed a premium on curiosity and how can we do things better. Ultimately, 1,000 years ago when I was at Kraft, I had a boss who had this line. I didn't understand it at the time. I do now. I'm a little slow. But he said, Doug, better is best. Better is always best. And his point was, let's just focus on continuous improvement and constantly trying to do better.
Yeah, I love that.
We could be paralyzed while we're in pursuit of being the best. Let's just do a little better today than we did yesterday. And continuous improvement, I think, is the way of the world, because large organizations can't make giant changes on a dime. It's all a continuous improvement process. And I think the only way continuous improvement works is if there is unlimited curiosity in the environment.
Yeah, some companies are really doing a great job of it. I've done some work with Novartis, and they have Curiosity Month, and they want people to read 100 hours a year. And, there's a lot of great things we could do to make people more curious in that respect. But, in my research, I found like fear, the voice in your head, technology, environment, all these things impact how curious employees are. So even if you're a curious person as a leader, how do you get your employees to be more curious?
Well, this is just my personal philosophy. I believe, I talk about my leadership model. At the heart of it is honor people. The next ring is inspire trust. I find that high trust cultures create high curiosity cultures. And I've read all the books, Only the Paranoid Survive, and all kinds of other things. I've been in a lot of fear-based cultures and paranoid cultures. I don't find them to have an endless supply of curiosity.
Nope.
I find fear and intimidation is a dangerous, it's a slippery slope. You may create a breakthrough every once in a while because people are so paranoid that they that they come up with a breakthrough idea, but in the fullness of time, I believe the way you create a curious culture is to create a high trust culture where people can feel vulnerable.
Yeah.
If you can't feel vulnerable, you can't create a high curiosity culture. And I go back to all roads lead to trust. Stephen M.R. Covey wrote his book, Speed of Trust. He had the best tagline, the subtitle of that book, the best subtitle of all time, and write this down.
Okay.
I mean, Speed of Trust, and he said, it's the one thing that changes everything.
Oh, yeah.
If I'm in a high trust team, I don't care how dire the situation is, I believe we're going to find a way to get through it.
Yeah.
If I'm on a low trust team, we're not going anywhere. And so for me, I buy the notion of create a high trust culture, and your odds of having a more innovative, more curious culture go up exponentially. So that's the path I traveled to get to curiosity.
Well, you brought up Jack Welch earlier, and I'm curious what you think of trust in that setting. If you know that the bottom 10% or you're going to be gone, or what do you think of those kinds of rules that you just keep a certain percentage of people, or there's a certain amount of pressure to be the best?
Well, I think you want that to a degree. I think this is all every company and every culture is different, just like every leader is different.
Right.
So, and Jack, Jack is actually, my family was the founding family of the town Jack grew up in Salem, Massachusetts.
Huh.
And and I sort of, Jack was just retiring. I don't know him well, but I know him. And he was a god when I was becoming a CEO. He was the CEO of the 20th century by fortune. And he talked about his book on the 4 E's, and one of those E's was edge. And he brought edge to conversations. I think that can be healthy with the bottom 10% have to go, because he's forcing candor on an organization. I would like to encourage candor in an organization, but I'd like to do it in a more constructive way. But that 10% rule that he had, the bottom 10%, challenged people to be very candid with the people that were working there, as opposed to, I thought the candor was healthy. But what Jack also brought to it was energy. One of his other E's was energize. And Jack brought an insatiable curiosity. His desire to do better was second to none in the world.
Yeah.
And he brought that into every meeting, into every conversation. How can we do better? What are we doing? He was curious, and he expected his executives to be curious. And he modeled it. And in fact, if you weren't being curious and you weren't being innovative, you did feel at risk.
Yeah.
So, and that worked for him for 20 years. I think every culture is different. He created a culture that worked for an extended period of time. It's not the culture I would create because I'm not Jack Welch, but I know better than to throw stones at glass houses, because I live in one too. And it worked for him, but I believe you build high trust cultures, that promise is a more enduring promise of creativity and curiosity.
Well, you have a very kind nature that what you've written about was somehow influenced a little bit by some other things you've gone through that weren't maybe the best experiences in the world. You had a near fatal car wreck, and you say that taught you more about love and leadership. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's important. A couple of other things that relate to this conversation. When I was owned by KKR at Nabisco, they weren't interested in love and let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. We had to pay down an enormous debt and get this thing out of private equity hands back on the public Uh, and the kind of leadership that you and I are talking about was not necessarily being modeled from above. Okay? I would tell you, any leader can, if they build a solid leadership foundation, can bring that to bear on the situation that they are managing. I was in the middle of trying to turn things around at Nabisco, which we did. And I was the guy that was talking lovey-dovey covey language. You do have to perform. You have to be very tough-minded on standards of performance, but I would contend you also have to be very tender-hearted with people. And so anybody can do this at any level. You have to perform and you have to take care of your people. Ultimately, that's what this is all about. At Campbell, when I got there, we had to perform too. This wasn't just, okay, now we're all going to love each other. We turned over 300 of the top 350 leaders of the company in the first 3 years. To my knowledge, there is no Fortune 500 company that's had that kind of turnover led by a CEO in the middle of a turnaround. We promoted 150 out of the 300 that we turned over out of 350. We promoted 150 from within, but we went out and hired another 150 leaders from outside. A lot of change going on, a lot of agita in the organization while I was writing all those thank you notes. So you do have to be tough-minded on standards. You have to perform too. So let me be clear about that. My car accident happened on July 2nd, 2009. And I was in the back of a car driving to my home in New Jersey, and my driver momentarily lost his concentration. It was 4th of July weekend on the New Jersey Turnpike, which is like the Indy 500. I mean, everybody's trying to get to the shore. It's crazy. Right. And so he was zipping home and wasn't concentrating, and we drove into the back of a dump truck and going between 70 and 80 miles an hour.
Wow.
And the dump truck didn't move. Fortunately, we were in an SUV and our lives were saved. He walked away, his airbag deployed. My torso was crushed, and I guess I would say I am living proof you can put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Wow.
8 surgeries in 10 years now. And
that's awful.
Here to tell the tale. But the day I went in, turned out about 18 hours of surgery at the Audrey Fold Trauma Center in beautiful Trenton, New Jersey. My wife was brought in, and she was waiting for me to get through all the surgery. And then I was not awake. And then I woke up in the emergency room eventually, and my wife was holding my hand. I was totally disoriented. Fortunately, I was on drugs. In this case, that was a good thing. Mm-hmm. But I am totally disoriented, never been in anything like this. And she was holding my hand, and she said, "I'm here." And her love for me was palpable. And it got me through an incredibly traumatic situation in a way that even describing it now, I get a little choked up. And out of that experience, I have found if I show up in an organization, we all metaphorically go through a car crash every day. I mean, today's a disaster. This went wrong. That went wrong.
Yeah.
If I show up as a leader and I say, "I'm here. How can I help? I'm here. How are we going to deal with this? I'm here. Let's figure it out." I have found that we can move mountains. Yeah. And it's all about bringing love and consideration into a tough situation where you got to perform and you got to survive. And these things are not mutually exclusive. You can have a tough situation And the more love you bring to it, the more consideration you bring to it, the more you adhere to high standards, the better off you are. And so that experience for me, and all the experiences in the decades since, have reaffirmed for me that caring matters. It's insufficient, but it matters. You have to be competent. You have to perform. But I believe if you want to perform in an enduring way, you have to care. And people need to know you care. And that was my big aha moment a decade ago. And what a blessing that I had it, that I survived it, and that I can now write about it and carry it forward.
Yeah. Wow. I can't imagine going through that. And I think I'm really appreciate that you shared that story. And I think a lot of people have setbacks and they have horrible things happen to them. And just, even if they don't even have that, there's a lot of people who've gone through failures. And you mentioned being, let go, and there's all these things. And I think failure and setback has been viewed differently. I think each generation, we're starting to see it as more of a learning lesson for what can we learn from this, instead of something that was just something so awful. Do you see a change in that?
That's happening. It's inarguable. As the world is becoming, as we're dealing with this, what my friends at Harvard call the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
And the cycle times are getting faster and faster. Failure is a fact of life. And so you need to deal with it constructively. And the concept of fail fast and fail often and learn from it is not wrong. And so I see that being, I think there's wisdom in that approach. You just can't be complacent with it. You can't accept failure. You need to accept it and learn from it and do better the next time. I come back to what this leader who drove me crazy at Kraft 1,000 years ago said, better is best. So I just focus on, okay, what happened? How can we do better tomorrow?
Yeah, right. And if only we had a blueprint, but wait, we have the blueprint. We have it. And your new book, The Blueprint, 6 Practical Steps to Lift Your Leadership to New Heights, is out there, and everybody has the blueprint now. So how can they find it, and how can they find out more about it?
Well, it'll be available for sale the first week of March. And it has been, I don't know if it is as of today, but it was the #1 pre-selling book on Amazon in the business category, business wisdom category. And so I think there's a lot of interest in this concept of developing your own personalized leadership model, something that speaks uniquely to you in a way that is practical and something you can act on. And where we're getting great traction with it is with people who can't afford to go to Harvard or to go to some kind of executive education program, but who hunger to do better in a practical way in the middle of their cockamamie life. And this book fills that void. So it'll be available the first week of March. Don't wait.
Go get it.
Sign up for it right now.
Everything you write, everything you do has been really an inspiration to me, Doug. It's been so wonderful to get a chance to chat with you again. I can't interview you enough because this is always fascinating. And I share
you say that to all the guys.
Oh, no, I don't.
I know that.
But I do share a lot of the stuff that you do in my courses with my students, because I think it's so important, and this will definitely be shared in my courses as well. So
Good.
Thank you
thank
again.
you.
And it was nice to see you this time. Last time I didn't get to see you.
Oh, it's good to be seen, and I actually I'll be out and about with this book tour for.
I bet you will.
So this is not the last time we'll see each other.
No, and I hope everybody takes the time to go check out The Blueprint. Thank you, Doug Conant.
And good luck to you.
Thank you.